Today we are addressing the topic and the phenomenon of genocide. And in doing so, we're tackling what is a difficult and challenging topic in trying to approach this form of organized killing and thinking about how it relates to the form of organized killing that we referred so far to as war. And one of the complexities is that we're dealing with a term that itself has only gained currency in the second half of the 20th century, primarily after the Second World War and specifically the Holocaust. But of course, it's quite possible to look backwards into human history and to identify cases of what we might now, in retrospect, call genocide. And that presents a number of important historical and conceptual challenges, all of which we cannot possibly address in the confines of a single session. So we will have to address these difficulties, these conceptual challenges, these political difficulties as we approach this concept of genocide. But we will also have to restrict ourselves in some way to think about a series of questions. One is to think about this articulation between war and genocide and how they relate to one another and whether genocide is itself a form of war. We will also focus primarily on modern instances of genocide, and particularly in the 20th century, as a way of thinking about what genocide can tell us about the characteristics of our societies, whether through the specific case of the Holocaust, we'll go into some detail there, but also to think about more recent instances of what are sometimes referred to as ethnic war, particularly the cases of Rwanda and the Balkans. Now, one of the things that we will see and think about is the ways in which genocide have been closely related to utopian projects, projects that were founded premised on the idea that society could and should be radically reshaped. We will also relate this in particular to modern conditions in terms of identity and the specific forms of anxiety over identity that are generated within modern societies. So that one of the ways in which we think about genocide might well be as a radical response to a quest for a purity of identity that ends in the removal of the other, of whatever group is deemed to corrupt or undermine society. Let's first talk about this term a little bit, genocide, which is one that is originally coined by the Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1943, and all studies of genocide really often very much start with Lemkin and his early reflection on what genocide contained. And Lemkin, in fact, had quite a sophisticated, maybe at times ambiguous and contradictory understanding of what genocide might contain. But he certainly coined the term and played a very important role in advancing this idea and in contributing to what would become the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. That was to be signed in 1948. And so one of the first ways in which we could, of course, approach genocide is through its legal definitions, since this is the manner in which it has been prosecuted, but also the ways in which it is often referred to in the context of international politics and international law. So let us look at this definition. The convention, therefore, signed in 1948, defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial or religious group, such as these acts could include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm, bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, We could already, in approaching this definition, start to identify a number of potential issues or contentions that might be up for dispute. Some have underlined that the definition excludes, or certainly makes no mention of, group affiliations other than national, ethnic, racial, or religious. For instance, there are no affiliations of group by class or political allegiance. This is not because the drafters of the convention ignored these groups, but rather because there was significant opposition, particularly by the Soviet bloc, to including anything about class or political allegiance. This was interpreted, of course, in the light of the previous, particularly Stalinist policies of the 1930s and possibly 40s, which could obviously quite conceivably fall foul of the Genocide Convention. And this, of course, starts to draw out the fact that the legal definition of genocide is not an abstract, strictly academic definition, but one that is a product of a particular period and very much politicized. Secondly, if we wanted to look further at this definition, we come across this idea of, or question of, intent. So we're told that in order for genocide to occur, we must have an intent to destroy a group. Now, the difficulty with intent is that it is not always very easy to identify intent. Perpetrators of genocide are not always forthright about their intentions. Very often they have tried to conceal them. And then, of course, there's a difficulty in the sense that we might observe an outcome that resembles genocide. So we might see a group being destroyed in whole or in part, without the intent being very explicit, or even without the intent necessarily being there, or at least one that we may have to infer indirectly. So, for instance, it may be that certain policies were enacted which were not explicitly about destroying a group, but who the effect of which might very predictably or reasonably result in the destruction of a group. So perhaps policies that might lead to a famine, to the displacement of populations, all of which might have a genocidal outcome, even if the intent is not specified as such. And so it does raise this difficult question, really, about whether genocide is to be judged by intent or by outcome. Do we determine if there's a genocide because the net effect is a destruction of a group, or do we recognize genocide because we can find, or we can identify, or we can infer a clear intent to destroy a group? This relates further to questions about what counts as genocide in terms of scale. So in the definition, we're asked to consider intents to destroy in whole or in part a group. So, of course, if a group is entirely destroyed, or if the intent is to entirely destroy a group, then of course we can reasonably talk about genocide. But in fact, historically, that's very rare. Few genocides could be said to have been entirely successful to destroy a group. So we're always talking about partial genocides. But of course, the question then becomes, when does genocide start? A single hate crime motivated by bigotry or hostility to a group would not necessarily amount to a crime as elevated as genocide. But on the other hand, we don't necessarily want to go down the route of simply quantifying a percentage or an absolute set of numbers above which we move away from, hate crimes or lesser acts towards a category of genocide. So there is here a further issue about scale. Finally, another term that was discussed in the context of the drafting of the convention is the idea of cultural genocide, whereby we are not merely considering the destruction of the physical destruction of a group, the bodily interdiction, annihilation of a group, but also the destruction of a group's cultural way of life. So this again was something that Lemkin thought about. This was something that was part of the discussions around the convention, but was also opposed by significant member states, because obviously the idea of cultural genocide would resonate strongly in the context of colonialism. And of course in 1948, still very large parts of the world are under colonial domination. It also, of course, opens up a further set of issues around how broad this cultural genocide might be, because of course the history of humanity has largely been one of cultural diffusions, certain ideas and certain ways of life spreading, being imposed in various ways on others. And so we might end up with a definition of genocide that might be overly broad, or at least one which might not necessarily allow us to make very refined distinctions, and that reasonably there might be a difference between, let's say, religious conversion associated, for example, with the spread of Christianity or Islam or any major religion for that matter, and genocide as the physical destruction of particular groups. These questions are undeniably fraught, and notably fraught, of course, because genocide has become a very politicized category, one which involves competing claims, groups who want to have recognition for their historical grievances are often led to invoke genocide as a marker of their absolute suffering and the need for redress. And conversely, few societies or states are willing to accept to be labelled as having committed acts of genocide, given the moral opprobrium that is, of course, very rightly associated with the idea of genocide. One, perhaps we can start to address, I think, some of the difficulties that we've encountered, certainly not all, but some of the difficulties we encounter with the legal definition by taking a more scholarly one that is not necessarily buttressed in the same way by the political influence of major states, by looking at, well, one of them would be the one proposed by Helen Fine, who tells us that genocide is sustained purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity directly or indirectly through interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of group members, sustained regardless of the surrender or lack of threat offered by the victim. And I think, in fact, I'd like to highlight the last part of that definition, the disregard of surrender or lack of threat, because I think that's particularly important in that, for our purposes, in contrasting with war. I mean, we'll return to that in a moment, but we can note that certainly one of the images of war that we have been working with is the idea of a struggle of wills between adversaries, the image of the wrestlers that Clausewitz invokes in the first few pages of On War. So there is at least one conception of war that is premised on a certain idea of symmetry. Both sides are fighting one another, and one wants to impose one's will on the other. And we can do so through the infliction of pain ultimately, but the idea is that there is a settlement to that, a moment where the war ends and where both parties agree to perhaps a new status quo. So it is possible in that context for to surrender to an adversary. But of course, that is potentially what is denied in genocide. One cannot surrender to an adversary that seeks to destroy you, since the only thing that they desire is your destruction, or at least the primary thing that they desire is your destruction. Now, if we were to talk about the empirical record of genocide, as I indicated, we have a term that we inherited from the second half of the 20th century or mid-20th century, but of course one can read history, back into history, genocidal massacres, at least as far back as the ancient world. Some have invoked the destruction of Carthage by the Roman army in the 2nd century before the Common Era. One might think perhaps of the Mongol invasions of the 13th and 14th centuries, and of course the various European colonizations of North and South America, Australia or Tasmania have produced certainly outcomes that could merit being defined as genocide. There's a set of complicated issues again here, about this relationship between colonization, imperialism, and genocide that we can't fully untangle here, but we nevertheless I think is important to note. One thing, of course, to say as well is, and again this plays into the idea of intent and outcome, is that the outcome of certain colonization in several parts of the world by European peoples resulted in dramatic civilizational collapse, particularly in the Americas, where the civilizations of Latin America, whether the Aztec or the Incas, were effectively largely wiped out, and population numbers collapsed precipitously. That said, the population collapse, as we can see on the left-hand side of this graph, is primarily caused by disease, by the exposure of local populations to pathogens that they had no immunity against. So we see particularly this very marked in the Mexican context, that a series of epidemics dramatically cut the numbers of the native populations in Mesoamerica. There's not much indication that these diseases, these cases of diseases, were part of an intent by the European colonizers, although there have been contexts in North America, for instance, where disease was deliberately spread to native populations. But this is very much a case of genocide appearing more as an outcome than necessarily as a clear intent, even if, of course, the colonizers in Latin America, notably in other parts of the world, were often can be held responsible for quite significant crimes and actions which effectively had the net outcome of destroying ways of life, if not actual groups. Further to this, we I think have to consider what has often been referred to as the first genocide of the 20th century, the near extermination of the Herero and Nama people of Southwest Africa by the German Empire in the 1900s. Here a photo on the right of some of the survivors of that genocide. And again, this is instructive for our purposes, first of all because there's a continuing strand here in colonial history, and certainly I think one of the ways in which we might then understand the subsequent use of genocide by the German state within Europe is precisely as a colonial project within the European context, an extension of an attempt to extend German territory into Eastern Europe, as well as an attack on its domestic or regional Jewish populations. The Herero Nama case is again important because some of the means that were deployed first appear in this particular context, and that in some ways it prefigures what was to come. If we are to stick with the 20th century, and I think this is what we will do for today's session, there are a number of candidates for acts of genocide in the 20th century. Of course, the Nazi Holocaust between 1938 and 1945 stands out, targeted as it was as Jewish populations, Romani populations, but also the physically and mentally disabled. We have the Armenian genocide between 1915 and 1918, which is estimated to take between 1 and 1.5 million lives, and continues to be absolutely contested and denied by contemporary Turkish governments. We have more recently, of course, cases in Bosnia-Herzegovina or Rwanda, and we'll return to those in the last part of this session. And then we have a set of cases that are either less well known or more difficult to fit within certainly the legal definition of genocide, precisely because they do not conform to the understanding of genocide as being primarily targeted at racial or ethnic groups. So Soviet collectivization and what is often described as a forced famine in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933 resulted in millions of deaths that are not attributable to ethnic or racial prejudice, but share in common an attempt at the re-engineering of society on a radical scale, and the identification of groups that stand in the way of that. We similarly have the Indonesian military's killing of at least 500,000 individuals identified as communists between 1965 and 1966. We have the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, who between 1975 and 1979 killed around 2 million individuals, about a quarter of the Cambodian population, identified as class enemies, although it's true that certain ethnic groups, including the Vietnamese, the Chinese and the Muslim Cham, were also targeted explicitly. We have the massacre of around 200,000 indigenous Mayans in Guatemala around 1982 as well. And then, of course, more in the 21st century, bring things to our current era, there are a number of situations that have been described in genocidal terms, whether it is Darfur in South Sudan, whether it's events in Myanmar, whether it's the attacks on the Yazidis in Iraq by ISIS. All of these have received the label of genocide in some parts. Again, there's a difficulty here in what we label as genocide, and what the distinction that perhaps arises and has been employed is one that makes the distinction between genocide and acts of genocide. That's to say that genocide might be the aggregate phenomenon, and obviously that requires a certain scale, whereas actual genocide can be much more localized and smaller in scale, but nonetheless betray an intent or a logic of genocide. So we could perhaps deal with some of the difficulties that we have in determining what counts as genocide or not by simply referring to genocidal violence that has a genocidal character, whether it escalates or amounts to a full-blown genocide or not. So let us then broach the question of the relationship of genocide to war. Now, a first thing we might say is that genocide frequently, but certainly not always, occurs under the cover of war, so that it may be in the context of a war that genocide takes place. And there's a few reasons why that might be the case. The first, of course, is that modern war, particularly when we think of it in its total dimension, we've had the occasion to talk about several times previously, modern war strengthens the state's ability to mobilize resources. It allows the state to exert greater control over society. So under those conditions where the state is strengthened, perhaps all the way to becoming a totalitarian state, this makes available means to carry out mass killing in a way that was not previously available. So in a way, modern war creates or empowers the state to acquire the means to conduct genocide. Another reason might be that war could be said to induce a brutalization of society, that in the context of war, life is devalued, society is becoming increasingly willing to accept killing as a solution to political problems. And moreover, one can observe a tendency to blame military setbacks on internal enemies, so that when war is not going well, there's a temptation to turn to groups that will be identified as responsible, who will serve as scapegoats. Certainly in the case of the Holocaust, the persecution of the Jews intensified as the war went badly. Perhaps on the broader scheme of things, what might follow Omar Bartov when he tells us that following the First World War, there was the transfer of the idea of massive military death to the possibility of massive political or ideological death. This perspective would really that the experience of the First World War itself induced a widespread brutalization of European society, a radicalization of European society, a willingness to accept mass death, to inflict mass death. And in that sense, the First World War prepared the terrain for the Holocaust. Now, this proximity between war and genocide, of course, raises ultimately the question of whether genocide is itself nothing less than a particular form of war. And of course, there's obvious similarities. Both war and genocide entail a hostile relationship between identified groups and involve the perpetration of organized mass killing. This is what has prompted the scholars Marcuson and Kopf to make the claim that the strategic bombing of Germany and Japan, in which civilian populations were explicitly and deliberately targeted for killing, were genocide. And that thermonuclear war would be even more so a case of genocide. In other words, what Kopf and Marcuson are saying is that where war induces large civilian casualties, where civilians are targeted purposefully, then war approaches or is equivalent to genocide. We find in Martin Shaw perhaps a more sophisticated reflection on how war and genocide relate to one another. And Shaw makes a further distinction that I think is useful to complexify the account of Marcuson and Kopf. Shaw suggests that genocide is a form of war, but crucially a form of war in which social groups are the enemies. So this means, however, that for Shaw, total war, the targeting of civilian populations, is not quite yet genocide. For Shaw, this is rather a case of what he refers to as degenerate war. This allows Shaw to set up a typology between classical war, degenerate war, and genocide. In classical war, states fight one another through the means of their armed forces, and they seek to defeat one another by destroying or disabling the other side's armies. So far, so Clausewitzian. Degenerate war, however, involves conflicts in which civilian populations become deliberate targets. So again, the case of strategic bombing, the case of total war, more generally, is a case of degenerate war. But crucially, in degenerate war, the main enemy still remains the opposing state. The targeting of civilians is only the means to defeating that state. In other words, when states fight one another in total war, where civilian populations become crucial to the war effort through their mobilization in industry and other sectors of the society that support the war, there's a logic, in a sense, in targeting those civilian groups. But as soon as the war is won, the targeting of the civilian population ceases. The strategic bombing of Germany and Japan did not last a day further than the conflict. Once these states surrendered, the killing stopped. Now, of course, that's distinct from genocide, Shaw points out, because in genocide, the targeting of civilian, often defenseless populations is not a means to an end, it is the end itself. The very goal of genocide is the destruction of these groups, not the defeat of a state and the attainment of some form of peace with that state. So I think that allows us to think about perhaps one of the important distinctions we want to hold on to in terms of the use of organized violence, is that in cases of conventional war and even degenerate war, the aims of these conflicts fall short of the annihilation of the adversary's society. There is, in a sense, even in the most bitter of these conflicts, an implicit recognition of the right to existence of the enemy. And it is precisely that right of existence that is denied to the targets of genocide. Genocide is legitimized by profoundly dehumanizing the enemy, by denying them a legitimate right to existence. But then, of course, that then raises the further question about what motivates genocide. Why do states go beyond this more limited, even if often quite terrible, use of force in the context of war, all the way to pursuing the complete destruction of other societies? Some have been tempted to see in the Holocaust, for instance, a resurgence of primal murderous impulses, a reversal of the rationalism of modern societies. But others have contended that it is in fact the very values and characteristics of modern societies that are at the heart, or certainly are implicated in the occurrence of genocide.